All right, cool. So just so I get an idea, who is a engineer slash developer actively right now and does like programming every day pretty much? All right, one person, cool. Okay, cool. Who has like JavaScript experience in the past or like knows about React? Okay, you guys, cool. Couple people, awesome. Okay, cool. Just gives me an idea. That's perfectly actually, because it's really like just the baseline of like what is React all about, what does it do, how's it different, all that good stuff. I'm just going to start with myself. So my name is JP Wallhorn. So JP stands for Jan Philipp, and as you can see on the German flags, I'm originally from Germany. So I grew up there, went out to. Oh, really? Nice. Nice. Yeah, I grew up there, went to college out there, and then came over here for work and kind of stayed here, found my wife, got married, and now I have my own business. That brings me on. These slides will be available shortly after this talk. So this is basically just like a website. So you guys can, I'm going to tweet it out, or I'm going to send it in Discord and stuff like that. So you guys have access to the slides. You can look at it later on and ask me like questions later on or correct me if I'm wrong. So yeah, just going to share those slides as well. So yeah, as I said, I have my own company. It's called Syntx, and we basically are an agency that does marketing as well as development for mobile and web applications. And we also do CRM development for Salesforce. So it's another guy and me. The other guy is more into like digital marketing stuff, and I'm just a developer basically. And we have been around since June now, so a couple months now, pretty new still, but we're picking up a lot of business and a lot of traction, and so it's really awesome and exciting times right now. So I had the pleasure to work since then with Blue Bottle Coffee, which is like a coffee brand out here. I've worked with the US government, so I've just started a contract with them. And then I've also helped with some backends for some mobile applications in Node.js, basically. So it gives you like a rough idea. I've worked with a couple companies. I've have my JavaScript experience. I've been a software developer myself for over 7 years now. I went to college for software engineering and kind of like have been in that area for like a little bit of time now. Before that, I worked for a company called ServiceLink Auction. They were actually right across Farmers in Woodland Hills, so I saw them every day. And I was the engineering director there. I had a team of 7 people down there. And we were basically able to recreate a lot of the software application landscape. So we had the chance to really build up something from scratch and build it with the latest architectures. And one of the funnest projects was that we implemented a whole React JavaScript e-commerce store with focus on SEO. So we sold foreclosed assets for the banks online, so houses that couldn't be paid off anymore. So the banks gave them to us, we sell them online, we auction them, and so we built the whole platform to do auction online and then do marketing after that, basically, and before that. So that was a really cool project, and that's what I've done before I created my own company, basically. So let's talk about React JavaScript. So this is the roadmap, what we're going to talk about today. And so first of all, we're going to talk about like what, why, and how. Like what is React, why are we using it, and how does it work? Then we're going to talk about the foundation about React JavaScript. We're going to talk about some state management and what state management is, how can you do it. We're going to talk about create a React app because obviously everybody wants to like eventually create an app by themselves. And then I'm going to give you guys some useful resources that helped me along the road to kind of get some more grasp on certain things. So if you guys are ready, we can get started on this. And just FYI, I don't know if you guys know Wes Boss. He's like he like does a lot of online courses, especially for React, and he actually like shared the slides with me in terms of the template and the styling. So huge thanks to him for sharing that and making that public, basically. All right, so what, why, and how? So what is it? So first of all, React JavaScript is not a framework. A lot of people think it's a framework, but it's not. It's not a Ruby on Rails. It's not a .NET. You can't compare that. JavaScript is really, it's just a JavaScript library with a rich community. So you can't do everything with React. You have to have combined other resources and libraries to get it started. So really, when it comes to React JavaScript, it is just handling the views. So if you're familiar with like an MVC concept, model view controller, it is really just a view, the user interface that you see on the screen, and it's not anything, the API has nothing to do with that. It's just the view that you can see on the UI part. And really what they do differently, and they were the first ones doing it, in my opinion at least, correctly, is they were the ones putting HTML into JavaScript. So everybody had JavaScript within HTML. So you had your HTML pages, you had jQuery within that HTML page, or you had some other scripts that were running in there. And they were the first one turning around. They were like, hang on, let's do it differently. Let's put everything in JavaScript, and let's put the HTML within the JavaScript, basically. So that's where the JSX support comes in. It's nothing that's you have to do when you do React development, by no means, but it makes it a lot easier and a lot nicer, and that's where you get a lot of advantages. And really what it means, JSX, is when you write your HTML code in your render method, you just write regular diffs and h1 tags and p tags and whatever you have there, and all of a sudden, in the middle of your HTML text, you just put in a JavaScript variable, and it works. So let's say you want to describe something like my name is, and then you pass in like a parameter in terms of like what the name is. You can just put in the name into the HTML code, and it will dynamically render based on what name you're passing. And so really JSX is just kind of like, it produces React elements in the background. So really, I put it in quotes because it allows you to use variables within HTML code. It's kind of like the way I say it. I don't know if it's like 100% correct, but that's how I would describe it, at least to somebody who tries to understand the concept behind it. And all files are getting compiled into one bundle that is getting served to the client. So the client renders the JavaScript and puts out HTML. So nothing changed here. Obviously, the browser, the client side is still rendering the JavaScript. So since you're going to have a bunch of files in your React project, because it's a component-based library, you're going to have, like, in your project, depends how big it is, 20, 30, up to 100, 200 files maybe. And to not have the user download all these files and put them together, there's basically something in the background that combines them all, bundles them, and you basically get a couple files. So you get like a bundle.js that has the whole JavaScript code in one file. It's all compressed, and then you get your index.html, you get a style sheet file, and then you get the images and the static files that you basically have. And that's all done by something else outside of React JavaScript, but that's basically how it works. And there's also where some complication comes in. So I told you I worked on an e-commerce platform with focus on SEO, and as you guys know, Google doesn't really crawl JavaScript that well. They really go based on the HTML content on the page. So if you now wrap everything of your HTML within JavaScript, Google now has problems to really understand what's on your page. So there are a couple of hurdles to get it to a point where Google can actually read what's on your page rather than just JavaScript, because it doesn't interpret JavaScript that well yet. It's still used like an Ajax crawler in the background. They said they're going to change it going forward. They said it was this year, but this year is kind of going to an end, so I don't know when it's really going to come out. But there are a couple of concepts to solve that, but that's something we're going to touch base later on. But just to give you a quick peek. So React JavaScript is really used to build complex and modern UIs. So it's really dynamic, and the way it's structured makes it really, really easy to build very complex UIs in big teams, because it's spread out that much. And I'm going to come to that, how it's spread out and how it's structured basically, and how it's very different from regular HTML pages. That's where it comes in. So the component-based structure. So what does that mean? What's a component-based structure? So if you look at this page here, we got a whole web page, and you guys probably know it. There's like a header component, which is like a navigation bar. We got a side drawer, which could maybe like a side menu. You got a list of specific items here that could be like a table list or different lists, and like Amazon, each could be like one product, for example. And then you get like a side component, for example. So normally in regular HTML, if you would build like a website, this would all be in one file. So this would be like page, landing page, for example. So you call it home or something like that, and you put all your code in that. And everybody who works on that page works on the same file, basically. So it's kind of tricky when you try to work on the same page in a big team, because you're going to have a lot of merge conflicts, basically, when you try to put it back together. So the nice thing is with JavaScript, with React, I should say, sorry, with the React JavaScript is each of these components are different files. So there's one file that's the page, and then the page imports components on this page, I should say. And then it renders them together. So basically, you write this component once, or you write this list component once, and whenever you have another page that has a list component, you can just import the same exact component again without rewriting it. So if you have 10 pages, 10 different pages that use like a list component, you write the component once, you import it, and boom, you're done. You don't have to do anything else anymore. You just write it once. So now you have a lot less code. Your code size that you have to serve to the end consumer, to the client, is a lot less because you're saving a lot of redundant code. And you can basically split up your work because somebody can work on the side drawer, somebody can work on the list component, somebody can work on the header component. And since they're all different files, there's not going to be any merge conflicts, basically. So this is really how React JavaScript is very, very different. It's the component-based architecture that they follow. And even when it comes to project management and sprint planning, it changed technical project management even, because they have to think differently of like, hey, how do I write my stories? Because now they have to write stories based on, oh, what could I put into components that I can re-leverage throughout my project now? So if I have a screen that looks like 5 times the same, but it's just a different product, I don't have to develop 5 screens. I develop the screen once, pass through the product name as a variable, and you're done, basically. So that's really what's interesting about it. And before I continue, are there any questions at this point when it comes to the component-based structure? No? Okay, cool. So as I just said, so I took Udemy as an example. We can literally see the same structure. So we have the navigation bar, which I have to develop once, because this navigation bar carries through every single page on Udemy, most likely. So they just do an import of the navigation bar, and it's there on every page. Then this is probably nothing more than a list. So this is a list, an unsorted list, and each of these lists are elements, like list elements, basically. And then each list element is built the same. They have a thumbnail, they have a picture, they got a title, they maybe got like a little flag over here that says bestseller, and then we got some stuff that basically says a description and how long the course is, the rating, and so on. You get the point. It's always the same. So now I basically write this list component once, I pass through the variable data, and now it renders it automatically. So I write this list component once, and I can use it for every single different page. So I want to give you some examples in terms of like, how does it look in coding? Like, okay, let's give me like a real example. So if we look at an app with a simple component, this looks like this. So we got our app down here. Oh, sorry, I should start from the bottom. So in the very bottom, we got our React. Can you see my mouse? Yeah, you can. So I'm down here, line 17. We get our React DOM, which renders an app, and it gets the app by query selecting the div component app, basically. So now, if I find this, I'm gonna render this part here, which is my app, and in my app I have a div, and then in this div you can see there are 2 components. The component is called person, and it has 2 attributes, or parameters, I should say, name and age. So I got max 28, I got menu 29. So now I just write a function, which could be just a separate file as well, and I pass through my props. Props is basically parameters I can pass through, basically. So now that I call name and age, I can reference those variables in my HTML code. So I return my div with my styling class name. I got my h1 tag, and now you can see this is JSX, basically. I can just say props.name, and boom, I have the name. I can say your age props.age, and now I get the age. So now I can reuse this person no matter what content everywhere in my app, basically, by just calling and importing the person, and then I pass through whatever variables I want to use within that. So we can take a look at a sandbox, and this is not the right link. What's going on? Oops, something just happened. 1 second. Let's start this again. I probably had like the wrong URL. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. So a good thing I know where it is. So let's go on, let me put the toolbar back in. React JavaScript. If my keyboard would work. Maybe not. I don't know what's going on with my browser. All right, I'll go show you this later. This is fine. I'm just going to skip this for right now. All right, I just wanted to basically show you like how it visually looks like. So we're going to maybe take a look at that later. So this is an app with a simple component. Very simple, very straightforward. Now we have a stateful component, which is one step above that. So this is our state component, and I think it's a little bit too small, so I apologize. Let me zoom in a little bit. So same thing happens in the bottom. I got my React DOM, which renders a timer. And basically, I have now a full class. So instead of just a DOM component, I have a full class here. And so basically what this does is I have my constructor, which sets a state. And so a state is basically used to manipulate and to control data within a component. So now within this file, I can control data dynamically, I can store it temporarily, and I can use this to make other transformations. I can use this to show my form, and so on. So to just cover the important parts, we're going to be rendering down here, and we're basically just rendering the seconds. And what this does is basically, it says this.state.seconds. So this means it's referring to the state and the seconds that I have. So now what it does is, when it mounts, and we're going to go talk about that a little bit later, but basically whenever you open this component in the browser, it sets an interval for this function called tick every second basically. So tick gets executed every second in the browser, and all tick does is it adds one more to this.state.seconds. So every second you get 1 + 1, 2 + 1, and so on. You get the point. So the funny part is, or the good part is now, every single time you change that value of seconds, it re-renders this component. So now every second you see it updating like a clock on the screen basically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so on. So you can manipulate the state and you can change it basically. So how is this useful? For example, you have a form and you want to fill out your first name, last name, and so on. You want to validate it. So in between, while you type it in, you change whatever you have. So it shows you live what you're typing in basically. And then once you do that, you can do live validation. So let's say you're typing in a 3-digit zip code. It can automatically tell you once you leave that field. There could be a validation that says, oh, hang on, you're missing like 2 digits in your zip code. This is an invalid zip code, for example. So because it's re-rendering every single time, it goes through the logic that you define in your code and then re-evaluates where you are right now, basically. All right, one more step, and then we're going to close this whole big picture. Component with external plugins. So this is another level. Simple component, stateful component, and now we're going to go one level higher with the components with external plugins. So what does this mean? So let me make this a little bigger again. As you can see here, I have my input, which is a regular HTML input and a title. And I can just type something in here. And then I have something down here that says output. And as you can see, instead of having 2 stars, it's bold. So basically, this is the notation form for Markdown. So what I'm really doing here is I'm observing the values in my input field, and I'm translating that with another function that's built in, or that could be a library, into something else and output that basically. So I'm taking this, and every single time I put something in there, it's basically re-evaluating, re-rendering the component. So now what it does, it returns this.state.value through the Markdown library basically. So there's a library down here that says MD, which is new remarkable, and then I return this element, whatever is my value that I enter here, and then I show that on the page. So while I'm typing, I can see the changes happening, basically. So this is really what's happening. So if I make this non-bold, I don't have to wait and press enter and then have JavaScript re-render the HTML page, basically. No, live, boom, right in there. All right. So this is kind of like what it is, why we use it, and how it works, right? So we talk about what it is. It's a component-based structure that's very dynamic. Why? Because it makes building UIs a lot easier, a lot quicker, and you can do it a lot more complex. And how we just went through it, showing you guys the components that you have possible. So now we're going to go through some foundation and going to clear up some of the stuff we just talked about. So we talked about components, but we haven't talked about pages and containers yet. So you can really split up the foundation, in my opinion, into pages, components, and containers. Those are kind of like the most important elements when it comes to it. So page, component, container, we're going to talk about each of those now. The page is pretty trivial, but a page contains containers and components. So what we just saw in the other where I described you guys how the elements look like, you have one page, and within that page you render all your components and your containers. And we're going to talk about what containers are in a second. But basically you just sum that up, and each page could represent a route, for example. So like /hello, /how to, FAQ, and so on. So each of those are a page, basically. Component, it represents a small visual block within a page. So you have multiple elements on your page. You break them up into components. So the components are normally really, really small. And there are different components. So we can basically the components break up the dependencies. Because think about component-based structure. There are 6 components on there. You have to change one little thing. Instead of touching the whole file and redeploying the whole file, you can technically just touch that one little file that represents that one component, and that's it. There's very less dependencies, a lot less risk. It is reusable throughout your project, so you can use this component everywhere in your project. And normally, that's the ideal scenario of how a component is defined. It's a stateless component, so you don't have a state within your component that manages data and how it shows. And they're also called dumb components. So if you hear dumb components, people talk about dumb components in React all the time. That's what it means. It's a stateless component, basically. Nothing that manipulates the values within that component. So it's just straight up HTML code. You pass through some variables in the props, and then it renders that, basically. Well, so if there are dumb components, there must also be smart components. And that's where the container comes in. So a container is a stateful component, basically. So it's basically the bigger brother of the component. And a container is, what does it mean? So a container is concerned with how do things work? So how do I make it work? So basically container does a lot of like API calls, and it processes the data, and it makes sure you validate the data, and you can manipulate the data within that container and then re-render it appropriately, and you can make manipulations and calculations and all that good stuff. So that's kind of like how you separate a component from a container. There's a lot of logic in there, and it's concerned about like how things work. You do a container. If it's like very straightforward, just a list element, you just do a component, basically. And trust me, you will go through this a long, long time, and you're gonna sit in front of your computer, is this a component or a container? I really don't know. So I still do it. I do Java, like React, over 3 years now, and I still sit at my home and like, let's see, eeny, meeny, miny, you were container today. No, I'm just kidding. But almost, like sometimes it's like so close, you're like, okay, I don't know, like I'm just gonna put you as a container. And there are exceptions to the rule, and those are just kind of like best practices, right? So there's no like, your app doesn't break if everything is a component and nothing is a container. Your app doesn't break. It's just kind of like best practices of how you should structure your application. So there are exceptions. For example, if you have a menu that literally just saves the information of the form in that state, then it's okay to use a component because it doesn't change data. It really just saves it so you can then send it off to like an API request, for example. So basically, It's provided by the data. So a container really is provide data to the behavior. So that could be conditional rendering, which is something that's supported by React JavaScript. So a good example is always when you fill out your registration form and you have a state. Not every country in the world has states, mostly just United States. So if you pick United States in your pick down, in your pick list field, the state becomes mandatory. If you pick, like, let's for example, Germany, the state disappears because Germany doesn't have states. So that's kind of like conditional rendering. You can say, if United States, then show. If not, then don't show it, basically. And a container will basically take care of that and then just pass through the information to the component. So let's look at a detailed comparison. Since I'm going to share the slide with you, I'm just going to I put an article on there, Medium article by Dan Abramoff. He works actually for Facebook on the React team. So he's a really good resource to just follow him on Twitter or like his Medium posts. He's a really great guy. But he basically put down a detailed comparison of like component versus container, best practice, what's in a component, what's in a container. All right, let's take a look at the folder structure because that's where it can become messy sometimes. So this is an ideal folder structure in my personal opinion. So again, there's no right or wrong, but this is how my apps, like 90%, look like when I build them from scratch. So we have the source folder right here on top. Obviously, this could be like, it's stored like a node application, so it's like this is like the front end. So at the very bottom, which is what's in the root, I in this case have like a git ignore in the Docker file since I use GitHub and I use a Docker. And then I have a package JSON, so everybody familiar with what a package JSON file is? All right, cool. If not, basically package JSON stores all the libraries that you're using in your application and stores the version of it as well, so you know which version number, and then the package log locks it down so you can't, let's say you deploy it to a server and it rebuilds it, it doesn't automatically use like a newer version of the latest library that you're using, so your app breaks maybe because the version breaks it, blah, blah. So basically the package.log defines 100%, hey, this is the version you have built it last with, so this is going to be the version you're going to be using for deployment on the server. And this is something that was introduced actually not too long ago. Yarn, which is like a library for JavaScript packages, they were the ones pushing for that. And Yarn is like a Facebook thing as well, kind of like to NPM, just like a competitor, but Facebook developed it. And NPM kind of like caught up on a lot of things by now, so like they're pretty much even right now in terms of functionality. But they were pushing for like log files because there were a lot of dependency issues. So now we got our app and index, which is kind of like the start directory of my React app. I kind of just define, hey, I've wrapped my router in there and be like, hey, here's all the routes. Whenever you get a hit, just do routing here and then boom, load up the routers, and the router will tell you where to go, basically. And you use a router if you have a multi-page application. And yes, you can do this with React JavaScript. It's not a single page application only. You can build multi-page applications, and that's what you use it for. So now we go top to bottom. Actions, this is where I define all my API calls. So in my actions, I have files for each of my categories of API calls. So if I do API calls to Google, there's probably like a Google.js file that has all the Google API calls, and I can import that. If I talk to, I don't know, DoorDash, I have a DoorDash.js file in there. All my API calls are in there. Components, those are obviously where all my components are. That's where all my components are stored. There are subfolder structures to organize it even more if it's a bigger app. I got my containers. I got my pages. If you use a multi-page application, then I have a routing folder. I got a selectors and a store. This is actually a little bit advanced when you use Redux in your application. We're going to talk about what Redux is in a little bit, very high level. And then I got my styles in here, so global styles that I'm going to import throughout my application, for example. And I got utility folders where I just have like constant defines certain utility class that's converting like $ to euro, for example. Something that I would use throughout the app as like utility, basically. So this is pretty much how 90% of my projects look like that I do. And this is pretty much, I believe, how Airbnb does it too, most of it. Not 100%, but I think it's pretty close to how they structure their code as well. And I mean, they're like, everybody kind of like follows them because they like follow like the best practice and have a lot of engineering blocks and do a lot of great stuff. But yeah, so I think they do great content, and so they have it very similar. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Props. So we talked about props when we talked about components and passing through data. So now we're going to talk a little bit about props, because you like, hang on, how you pass name and age, and now you have props.name. How does that work? So basically, it allows you to pass data from a parent wrapping component, meaning if I have my page, my home page, and I want to pass through in this little right corner where my name is, where it says hello JP, I can basically pass through attributes. And so how this works is back to the old example. Whenever I call my component, in this case person, I can define endless amounts of parameters when I call it, basically. So I could give it 100 more parameters. It's fully dynamic. So I can say name, age, social security number, address, street, whatever I want. I can just add it. Everything that I pass through here is then going to be available in my person function through the variable props, basically. So now I can say props.name, props.age, props or whatever I pass through, and it works. The only thing you have to make sure is you don't want to have too much props passing through, because the more you use, the more you have to be careful that you don't pass something through. It's going to crash your application because you're going to get an undefined. So if you render something like props.name, but name doesn't exist, then you're probably going to get an error message that tells you, hey, you have like undefined in here, basically. So you want to keep the props pretty slim and don't want to overextend it, and make sure that you validate that you have enough props before actually rendering it, so you catch your own errors, basically. All right, and we talked about this, and this is really, really important. It triggers the UI to re-render when changed. Whenever I change the person, whenever I change the value that I pass into another function, it re-renders the whole application. Not the whole application, everything that's triggered by that change, basically. So let's say I change, let's say this is dynamic too from an API call based on who's logging in. If I log out and log in, log out and log in with another username, it's going to re-render that whole chain that's behind it, basically. And that's where you have to be careful, because sometimes it could happen that you render components way too many times, and all of a sudden if you have a console log on the very end, you enter one value and you can see 10 console logs, meaning 10 things got re-rendered for some reason. So now 10 times, ding, 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 the application is re-rendering itself and the browser has to work like crazy. So that's why you want to be careful a little bit. But that's also where it's really cool, because you can just dynamically change something by passing through and just showing it dynamically on the screen. What just happened? All right, state. So the state is used, props is from parent to child. State is used to change the component within rather than by parent. So now within my state, I manage everything that happens within that component I defined or within my container, rather than accessing data that's getting passed through from the top. And this also triggers a re-rendering. And I can actually set up the easiest mistake every beginner will make. I made it myself like probably 20 times, if not more often, is defining a set state method where you change the state when you render it, basically. So if you set your state when you render it, it's going to be endless loop, because you're setting your state, then you render it because it's basically changing it. Then by changing the value, it's going to re-render again, because it's re-rendering, it's re-executing that function, basically. So it's over and over executing, and you just have an endless loop, basically. So you always have to define your functions outside of your return, outside of your rendering, and you have to define handlers, basically, that handle change, that only are getting executed if they are specifically called, not every single time you render the application, basically. And we'll go through that in a little bit. Actually, why not right now? So this is what we talked about. Let's see. So we got our component did mount, and I promise we're going to get to this, what this means, because this is probably very confusing right now. But let's just say component did mount means every single time I load my component, it does something. As you can see, it executes this .tick. let's imagine this .tick would be in the render, or in my return, I should say. Either way, actually my render, because return just has HTML code. So in my render, I have this .tick. Rendering, executing, changing, rendering, boom, 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 all the time. Since you're setting your state, it's going to automatically change. So basically, what I'm doing is, I'm taking it outside of the rendering method, and I'm going to say, I'm basically taking it outside of my rendering, because if it's in my render, it would re-render the application for it. I have a better example, I believe, so just give me a second when we come to that. So manipulating the state, that's where JavaScript is a little bit different. Not JavaScript, sorry. React, there's like an exception because, same example again. You saw here in the tick, we're manipulating the state. And you said this, set state, and then I call like an anonymous function, ES6. And I set the seconds to state.seconds plus 1. And you're like, this looks awfully complicated. Why can't I not just say this.state equals this.state plus 1? Doesn't work. You can't change the state like that. It doesn't work. Like nothing will change basically. It's not allowed basically. So basically, if you want to manipulate the state, you have to call the function which is called setState, and then that will allow you to change the state basically. Another thing that's notable and which is really handy is, let's imagine you don't just have your seconds in your state, but you have seconds, minutes, hours, name, date, for whatever reason. And now you're just updating seconds. It will not overwrite everything else to undefined or null because you haven't mentioned it in a list.state. It will really just update whatever you define in here and will leave the rest of the state untouched. So it's not like a JSON object or like an array. If you don't define the other elements that are already in there, it will like erase them. No, it will just update the ones you're calling basically. So what is this rerunning all about? What happened? Oh, tricked myself there. Okay, so what is this rerunning all about? And we talked about component did mount, lifecycle, and I promised you to get to it. And here is your new, and now you can be actually really surprised, wallpaper. And you're like, what the hell's going on? Let me show you guys the component lifecycle of React JavaScript. Version 16.3, since it's changing. So this is kind of like the latest one. And this looks insane. You know, like, what are you doing over here? So basically, this looks more complicated than it is in reality. And you're probably going to use 1 to 3 of those at 90% of the time, 95% of the time. So let's go through it one by one. So first, the constructor is getting called. Obviously, always the first one we're going to call the constructor. Now it's going to call something to get derived state from profs. And what that means is it gives you the new value and the old value. So you can kind of compare, when I change something on my UI elements, this as the new value different from my old value basically. So I can compare previous value against new value, which sometimes comes in very handy. Then I render. So now it's rendering. Now I have a component did mount. And to go back, if we go back to our tick, it's 0. Now we have it because it rendered and it's 0 at that time. Now we do component did mount, which executes the function this.tick. Since changing a state re-renders, we go back to this step. Actually, we go back to this step over here, and we basically now re-render again. And from there, we have get derived state from props, should component update, component will unmount, render, component did catch, get snapshot before update, get it out. I'm not going to go through everything. This is crazy. Anyway, but what I want to say is this is something you probably want to print out or just have it ready to look at, especially in the beginning, to kind of understand where am I jumping in basically. And these are all functions that you can basically access. So if we go back component did mount, and will unmount. Those are literally just functions you can call, and you can execute code within that state, basically, within that lifecycle. And will unmount basically means when you close down the component, let's say you switch the screen, it will do something in that state, for example, whatever it is. Like let's say you have a counter, but you want to stop the counter because you don't want to keep counting when you're already on a different page. So when you leave the page, you want to stop the counter, basically. So that's when you would use component will unmount. Component did catch is something new. This is where you can do error handling in the React to not have the whole JavaScript, do not have the whole app crash, basically. Advanced stuff. I'm going to come to it later. And credits down here because some Twitter user put this together, and so I gave him some credit for that. All right, so React is normally a single page application when it came out, right? It was one page. You could dynamically render content on there, and that's React, basically, right? Well, I said it's a library, so yeah, you wouldn't expect anything else. It's not a framework. It doesn't come with routing. You can't define routes in your web Apache or Nginx server and all of a sudden React can interpret that. No, you can't do that. So basically what React did is React can also be a multi-page application with the help of other libraries. And if you work in JavaScript or you start working in JavaScript, you will realize very quickly there is a library for everything. It's kind of like you go in the App Store. There's an app for everything. Same with NPM and JavaScript. There's a library for everything. You have to be careful you don't use too many libraries because you end up with 200 libraries. But there's a really good library. It's called React Router, basically. And so what React Router does, React Router allows client-side rendering. So I can do JavaScript routing. Instead of my Nginx route, I have one route that just says pass-through, and then React Router will do all the rest of the magic. So it will match whatever you have in the URL. It will read the URL, match that against your path that you defined, and then render the component that you defined, basically. And that's where you have the pages. Each route is normally one page. You can have one page with multiple routes in case you're passing through the dynamic values, for example, and so on. Yeah, so React Router. And also what you can do is you can do dynamic routings. So you can read like an ID. Then with that ID, you do a lookup via the API and then render that content based on the ID you're passing through. So you can do dynamic routing really, really, really easy, especially when you have searches and you want to show all the different URLs. You don't want to hard code every single course that you have on Udemy. No, they give you a list of IDs that will be put in the string, and then with that ID, you basically call the API that will then return the details about that course, basically. And it's actually pretty simple to set up. All right, what, why, how, foundation. Check. State management. Before we dig in, any questions? Am I talking too fast? Okay, good. If so, please stop. All right, so as always, per usual, there are multiple options to do state management. And trust me, if you look up what option to choose, you will not find one answer. So there's one called Flux. Flux is the default library by Facebook. So Flux is basically, they came out with React, and then shortly after or at the same time they came out with Flux, which is basically lets you manage your states. More just in the component, but more out in the app, because as you saw, a state is to manage data within the component. So what if you want to access that data outside of the component now in another component? Well, that's where it gets tricky, and that's where you have to have some sort of state management that goes above the React functionality. So Flux is one. And then there is the big one, Redux. And Redux is pretty much your final enemy. So if you see Redux, you basically just want to be like, okay, let me go to a conference, basically. But, I'm just kidding. But Redux is so popular, but still, I feel so hated in the community because it's so complicated and everybody tries to find a way to get rid of Redux. I don't know why. I don't find it that complicated, really, to set it up. Once you have it, you have it, but it's still a pain to set up. If you have a new project, you probably spent a good half a day spending setting up Redux. It's ridiculous. But it's really useful. So let's take a look at the architecture and what it does. And this looks really, really complicated, but I promise it's not that complicated. Again, so now we're going to look at React. We talked about React is just a view. So we got our template, which could be our page, a bunch of components, a bunch of props. Props is going to re-render. So now I have an event and I have my containers. And we talked about containers do the magic. Not really, but they do the data handling, they do how things work. So a container would call, for example, an action creator. And what's an action creator? So action creator we talked about, there was like a little actions folder in my path in the folder structure. All my API calls. So we're going to go from here, which could be my homepage on Udemy. Then somebody types in React JavaScript course. That then goes to a container, because that search bar is probably a container. And then that container takes the input and does an API call with the input you made to a service, which is probably their database, which returns a result. So now you have a result. So input, API call, result. Now you're sending this result into a reducer. A reducer is nothing more than just like a processor, basically. It's a huge case statement. You define all the different types of data storage that you have, like course materials, and so on and so on. User data, and so there are different variables basically. So you define, hey, where do you store this? And so when it runs through the reducer, you basically updates the store. So your store is kind of like, let's see, how do I describe this and not mess it up? Don't hate me for this if you're watching this, but you can just compare it like a local storage. It's not that, or it's not that. Please don't take me that. But it's basically something you write down in a notepad and then you can re-access it throughout your app. Basically. So it's a little store. And then selectors are basically filters. So you don't want to access the whole store, but you just want like this tiny little piece, basically. And then the container can use that. So why is this useful? And why do I go all the way around this? Why don't I just go from container to service and back to container? Well, when you refresh the application and press F5, it might go do the same thing over and over again. And again, you're just updating your state within your container. So if you need that data somewhere else, you have to make that same API call again. But if the data will always be the same, you just have to select it and dice it differently, basically. Why make 200 API calls? So the best example would be, I get search results for all my React.JS courses. So I ask my API for that. I store the results in my store because I now click on the first course and then I go back to the search results. I don't want to make another API call. I already have the data. So now I can just refresh the page and redisplay it by accessing my store and say, hey, give me that data back again one more time. So you do it again. Now I click on the second course. Wasn't it? Go back to the search results. It's just accessing the store. So through the selector, you can then access the store without doing another API call. So this will speed up your application enormously because if your API call takes like, let's say, 3 seconds to process, 2 seconds, however long it is, it's a lag basically whenever you go back into the search results, which is not really cool. And believe me or not, but you're actually gonna run into issues where your application is so fast because of it that the user doesn't even know something refreshed. To give you an example, we had a case where we loaded a lot of data just because we went to the page. And we loaded basically everything that was there. And then you search for your filter. Like let's say I have all my Udemy courses, I load them up in the beginning of my app. So now, cool, I have all my Udemy courses there. They're like, it takes me like a second to load, cool. Got it all in my store. Now whenever I do like look for React, look for Angular, look for this, it's just gonna access the store and filters through the results that I already have stored basically. It is so fast and there's no like this refresh page element that you normally see as like, oh, something happens on the screen. It will just refresh. It doesn't even like blink on the screen. It will just change the list that you're rendering basically. So you actually now have to think about how do I visually show I made an update? Like I clicked on filter, but like how do I show this? So this is like how fast it basically is because you don't have to go back to the server. You're working in the memory of the computer, of the client basically. And this is also why, people don't like Redux. It looks really complicated, but ultimately, I don't think it's too bad, and it gives you a lot of functionality that's pretty useful in the app. Any questions? Sorry, any questions on Redux when we look at this? Yeah. Yes, correct. So it holds states, but the states are accessible through like other components, basically. Yes. But you can have let's say you have user data, you have course data, you have, let's say you want to store some filtered data because like somebody saved a search, for example. You can have like 3 different variables basically where you define the search results, you store them, and then you can access them all 3 at the same time or just one or however you want to basically. So it's not just like one variable, like it can't just be only user data or only course data. You can like store everything in there basically. But yeah, there can't be like, if you have like, you're going to store like a filtered result, you have to like create a new variable for that and like store it in there. You can't just have like variable 1 give me like version 1 or 2 or something like that. So it's like a variable basically. We can talk about this maybe offline, and this is probably one of the things we're going to talk about like in the next courses when we talk about like advanced patterns. It's probably something where we dive in, do an actual code exercise, and then talk about like how it works 100%. But for right now, since it's not 100% React JavaScript, because it's a library, per usual, I'm just going to skip over this. I'm going to do high level because it always comes up. So Redux versus Flux. You're like, hang on, Facebook gives me something, it's called Flux. Then there's a library called Redux, which does pretty much the same thing apparently. What's the difference, and why do I use Redux over Flux? And Redux is really more popular than Flux. If you look it up, like you always want to work with Redux pretty much. This talk is so long, I don't even want to go over it. Like there is a Stack Overflow link with a great discussion that the creator of Redux basically posted his opinion in there and why he made it and what the reasoning behind is. You can read over it if you want to, but it's too long to cover it right now and probably bore you guys to death. So I'll share the decks and you can take a look at it. High level, Redux versus Flux. This is basically high level. Immutable state versus mutable state. So this is what we do. I think what your question was referring to, because you can only have one version of the state, right? There's no dispatcher here. You can talk about what the dispatcher is. Not going to cover it right now. There's multiple sources of the truth since it's a mutable state, while you have only one source of the truth in Redux. There is a single store in Redux while you have multiple stores within Flux, basically. So I'm just going to leave it like where it is right now. I'm not going to dive go more into depth about this, but just going to give you like a high-level explanation. And then there's a new kid on the block, the context API, to avoid props drilling, and you see articles, oh, context API is killing Redux. You don't need Redux anymore at all. So if you go out, if you look up stuff, you have to be sometimes really careful because there's a lot of opinionated articles, especially like on Medium and Hacker Noon, that will tell you, oh, context API is out. Forget Redux, just kill all your project. You're going to be so much greater. And it really depends. Like sometimes, yeah, it can save you to use Redux, but sometimes no. Redux is still very different from a context API, and you still need it. So what does a context API? Context API is something that came out with the React JavaScript version 16 point something. I don't remember which one. But it basically was a recent addition to React JavaScript. And it basically avoids the prop drilling. So what's prop drilling? So we talked about we can pass variables through props. It's component-based structure, cool. So what about page here, component, 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 and you need the data very down here. You have to pass through the data from component to component to component to component. You get the point, basically. You mean like a nested? Yeah, you have to nest it and pass it through every single time because you're drilling down, and that's what's called props drilling. And so now, if you forget it one step, you're screwed, basically. So you have to go through the whole chain and see where you messed up. Context API basically allows you, similar to the store, to build a provider, store the data in that provider, and then access that provider from anywhere in the app, basically. So rather than passing it through every single component through props, you can just access it on the last one where you actually need it. And again, this is a little bit more into like the next steps of React. So I'm just going to mention this, but not going to go into more detail. Create React app. Oh, I need a break. All right, cool. So create React app. So everybody wants to create a React app. We talk about React apps and you're like, how do I even create one, right? Like, how does this work? So there's what's called boilerplates, and boilerplates means there's like a pre-configured, like somebody went ahead and basically gave you a toolbox of everything that's necessary to get it up and running. Since it's just a library again, you can't just get Redux, you can't just get React and it runs like Rails, for example. Like you can't just like get Rails or like Ruby on Rails and you can't just say Rails S and it works. No. A lot more goes into it. So that's why Facebook, with a bunch of contributors, create React app, which is kind of like a boilerplate that you can just install, comes pre-configured, and you can actually start right away. So it's a very free starter pack. So it's a very easy installation, and I have like a little animation of it. So this is like your, your terminal. So you say npx create React app, my app, and then it's fetching that package, and it's going to install it into the folder my app. You can call it whatever you want to. And basically it's installing it, and then it's putting it into the stuff and into the folder, and then it tells you here are your commands you can use, and then it's basically starting to the development server, and then it's locally available under a certain port, and then you can start doing it. So I'm going to repeat it one more time as an endless loop so we can watch it all night long. So we're going to do create React app, and I can use yarn or npm as well. It doesn't matter. They used npx. As you can see, yarn adds version. There's no log file yet. It's resolving the package. Tells me yarn start, build, test, eject are my variable, my commands that are available. It's switching into the my app and does yarn start. And yarn start basically starts my development server that then compiles all my code within that development server. And then I can open it up in my browser. So one more time. So create React app, my app. My app is the folder basically. It's installing it. It's resolving all the packages that are part of this dependencies. 1 second, takes a second. We can do, it's basically switching it in here, yarn start, npm start, and then start development server. It's compiling, and then it's accessible via your browser over localhost 3000. And it's just a development server. And we can do the same exercise locally. So let's just say my folder. I don't know if I can make this one bigger. Hang on, let me see. Nope. Somebody know how to make the terminal? Oh, there we go. All right. All right. So this I'm going to use yarn. Hang on. I'm telling you I'm doing this so often, still forget it. There we go. Yarn create. I should write this down. Create. Okay, there we go. Yarn create React app. Then I'm just going to call this intro. I did make a mistake. I knew it. There we go. I'm just going to copy this since sometimes when you present, you just mess up all the time. All right, so we're going to do this. Sorry, just React app. That's why not create. Okay. So yarn, we're going to create something. We're going to do React app, which is what we want to initialize or create. And then I'm just going to call this intro. So it's going to store it in the folder intro. If you want to do npm, you can do npm init for initialization and then React app intro, or you can use npx, whatever you want to use, since there are like 200 solutions right now. So I'm just going to add this. Let's see. We're going to go through it once it's done. All right, let's go through the top. So first, it's resolving my packages and fetching my packages, linking dependencies, and build fresh package. What does that mean? Package.json has libraries. Libraries have dependencies, even stuff that you don't need but the library needs. So it's downloading all of that. Then it's putting it into the folder I defined, in this case intro, which is under users JP code syntax intro. Then it's installing the packages. And then it's basically resolving the packages again. And then it's saving in a log file with all my dependencies and my version numbers. And then I'm initializing a Git repository. And success, create intro, add, blah, 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 my folder structure. And then now it gives me predefined commands that I can use. Yarn start starts my development server. Yarn build, I use that to build my production build when I deploy it on a server. So if I deploy it to, like, I don't know what's easy, Heroku, for example, I execute yarn build and it builds the latest build on the server. Yarn test runs all your tests to do like unit testing and stuff like that. And then yarn eject, we're going to talk about a little bit, because this, as you can see in a second, is very easy. So it's now in here. Hang on, where am I? CD intro, and I'm going to just launch this in VS Code real quick. So as you can see here, I got my package JSON, which has my dependencies and some other definitions. So right now there's literally just React app, and you can see all the scripts that are defined here. And then I got my source with my app. And so my app basically is my app. And I have my app here, which is a class, and it does a render and a return. And so if I start this, yarn start. No, I don't want to, because it's already running. Let's see. My Google Chrome now works or not. Actually, you know what? We'll just do Safari. All right, look, I already have a server running. Never mind. Okay. I can change. Never mind. Okay, we'll do it later. Where were we? VS Code. So now I can change this, and it will just basically, it's kind of like browser sync. If you know browser sync, it's the same thing. I can change stuff in my code, and it automatically refreshes my browser, so I have to click on F5 basically. And that's really it. From here, I can create all my stuff, like my components, my pages, and so on and so on. So now you're like, hang on, what does this really do? And we get to this in a second. Just remember this, really easy. And this is the structure again. I have it in a screenshot. So node modules, package JSON, we get the public stuff in the source file, right? In public, I can store like static files that I want to use when I deploy my app to the server, such as like a fav icon. If you have images, you can store them in there as well. As you guys are lucky, because version 2 actually just got released, I believe, last week. Had a bunch of new changes in there, and these are the features that are by default included basically in the beginning. So you get React.JS ES6 syntax support, you get language, auto prefix, fast interactive unit testing runner, live development server that warns you about common mistakes, a build script to bundle JS, CSS, and images, offline first service workers for progressive web apps basically, and hassle-free updates for above tools with a single dependency. This is all great. We can just skip over this. Basically, the newest additions, which I'm really excited about, is CSS and Sass modules. So I'm really excited about this one personally, because it allows you to import CSS and CSS like Sass files or SCSS files into your components and containers and pages, and then use those, have like your separate style sheets versus doing like inline CSS styling basically. And there were some other additions. So we got Babel 7 support, we got Webpack 4, we got Jest 23, and we got import SVG as React components. So if you now import like an SVG, like let's say you do import photo from me in Manhattan, weird name, from this folder directory, which is basically just an input, like a SVG file. Instead of using like the image tags, you can now just say, you can now literally use that variable name as like a JavaScript variable, and it will render that picture basically. The SVG, I should say. So why worry free? It's because no Webpack configuration is needed. And you're like, hang on, what is Webpack? So let me explain to you what Webpack is. another library. Hey, we're just in JavaScript, right? I told you guys, React JavaScript is just for viewing stuff. So Webpack is, personally, I love everything that they do. One of my most favorite libraries out there right now. But basically, they're the ones compiling your JavaScript code. So since it's, again, just a view library, there you need Webpack basically to locally compile your JavaScript code and to run it. And so this is how it works. And even on a server, it takes all your different JavaScript files that you have, all your different components, all your different style sheets that you have, and puts them into one JavaScript file, one style sheet file, and all the different pictures like static assets that you have basically. So at the end, you get like a compressed, no white space, no spaces, and so on, JavaScript file as a bundle that's getting served. Then that bundle is getting executed by the client, by the browser, and then you can actually see the HTML code behind that, basically. So it serves those bundles to the clients, and that's pretty much very high level of what it does. And it's a lot more complicated what you can do with it, but we're just gonna make that's gonna be something on the advanced stuff too. So you want more, right? So we talked about like, hang on, CSS models just got added. One of my favorite features. What did you do before? Inline styling? No, I did not, because I hate inline styling personally. Sorry about that. And it's especially for bigger projects to have like more configuration options, and you can actually manage the dependencies. You don't have to wait on them to update to Webpack 4. You can update to Webpack 5 whenever you want to. You can do the alpha version in production if you're happy, and have sleepless nights. So you can eject it. Sounds so cool. So basically, you can eject your project and show all the configuration behind it. And just to be fair enough, you cannot undo this. So if you do this once, you can never go back. So if you eject your script files, you can't go back and put them back to where they were. Once ejected, they're ejected. You have to start from scratch, basically. And you're basically going to be in charge of dependencies, and it's going to open up the Webpack configuration. Before we jump to resources, we're going to do it. Yarn eject. Yes, I want to eject. Oh, it does a lot of wonderful stuff. All right, goodbye. There we go. Now we're going to open this again, and I can see new folders and a modified package JSON file. Ooh, all my dependencies all of a sudden. It went from one dependency to, I think like 30. A lot. This is what everything is included with Create React App, what we talked about, like Babel ESLint, Babel Jest, dot environments, ESLint for linter support, Jest for running tests on your JavaScript React code, mini CSS extract plugin, optimize CSS, post CSS, React DOM, Sass loader, style loader, URL, Webpack, and so much more. Now you can define all your versions whatever you want to. Full control. You can go to your scripts that were defined here. You can go to start, and you can see everything that's behind start, basically. Not going to go through it, but if you want to change it, feel free. Config, here you can see like path, environment variables. You can see your Webpack configuration, one for dev and one for production. This is where you can define your local development server. And this is where you would add stuff like the CSS hot module, like the CSS modules. You could add it before manually. Now it comes built in. But again, one dependency versus you saw probably like 30 right now. So this is like your server configuration, and this is a whole nother course and beast. So we're not going to cover this right now. But just want to tell you, if you eject it, you basically see everything behind the curtain, and you have full access, kind of like putting root into your Linux command console. So meaning you now have to manage your dependencies, basically. You can't say, I just want to have one dependency. So now you have to manage all your dependencies. If you want to go back to like the one dependency that you want to manage, you basically have to set up a new project and copy over all your files, basically that project. So yeah, this is pretty common in bigger projects. You always eject it normally because you want to be in charge of the dependencies. You want to be able to you want to be able to choose when you want to update and when not. And so in bigger projects, pretty much all my projects I've worked in companies, we always eject. But for like fun projects or like learning, I wouldn't recommend ejecting in the very beginning. One thing I forgot. Oh yeah, so create React app. There are other boilerplates for sure that you can use. Create React app is the most popular one. Something other to mention is probably Next.js, which has built-in server-side rendering. So now the server executes the JavaScript for you and serves you static HTML content versus the bundle. And this is something we can talk about next time as well in terms of like advanced features. Then I'm going to cover it a little bit more. I did a talk about Next.js in a JavaScript meetup in Westlake Village actually. So I can share the slides with you about what Next.js is, how does it affect SEO, how does it improve it, how does it solve the problem of Google not be able to render JavaScript and so on. I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. Resources. So last but not least, I don't even know what time it is, 8:50, okay, cool. Resources at the very end. So there's something that I want to give you guys along your way if you have questions or want to learn more about it. And this is something that helped me personally. And you do learning by doing always. You can't just watch a video, you can't just hear a presentation, you're all of a sudden gurus. You have to do it. Set up a project, do something easy. There are so many easy projects you can do and just learn it by do it. One thing that I really like is the Udemy course by Maximilian. He is the top-rated Udemy course in React JavaScript. I put a link down there as well. He has 2 courses. The one I linked is the foundation one. He has one advanced patterns as well. Hours of content. He does a phenomenal job of explaining React and goes in particular through examples. You build actually an app with him in the course and you go through everything with him. Building a basic app using Redux, using API calls, error handling, testing with Jest. Jest is basically the testing framework developed by Facebook for React. You're going to go through Webpack configuration. You do the whole bit. There's everything in there. Great, amazing course for starters. You're going to jumpstart like very, very quickly with this one. Another one is obviously the React.JS official website. A lot of documentation there to look up stuff. Always recommend that one. The Wes Bos courses. Personally, I like Wes Bos a lot. He has a bunch of courses about React. From beginner to, he just released sorry, an advanced course where he even covers like GraphQL servers and Apollo clients and stuff like that, where it goes into like GraphQL stuff, implementing that instead of REST APIs. Amazing course. He has a bunch of courses, only recommend those. And there's React training especially for React routers. So those are the makers behind, or the main responsibilities behind React router. So there is a training for that, which is really good. And then there is the advanced React workshops by Ryan Florence. Ryan is really like an amazing guy. He shares great content and advice as well. So he has his own workshops, and he's traveling around the States doing those workshops right now. So if you hit him up, if you look up the site, maybe, I don't know if there's the workshop right now planned for the LA area, but his workshops are really cool too. All right, and that's pretty much it. Finished. And then, I don't know why, but Copa Wes Bos, because that's what we said a couple weeks ago at a conference. React is evolving, and it's always changing with new versions. But the good thing is most of these are additions and not changes. So you don't have to relearn. It just gives you more features and better things, ways to handle it better and easier, and it makes your applications better. And you don't, like, there is a learning curve, yes, but it actually takes away of your work. So I hope this was useful, and if you have any questions, let me know.